The lights in the theater dimmed just enough to feel important, but not enough to feel kind. Rows of faces leaned forward, hungry for spectacle, for surprise, for something extraordinary to break the routine of ordinary dreams. The stage gleamed under white spotlights, polished and intimidating, like a place reserved only for people who already believed they belonged there. Then Ethan Walker stepped into the light. He didn't arrive with swagger. No dramatic pause, no confident wave to the crowd. He walked carefully, almost apologetically, as if he were afraid the stage might reject him if he moved too fast. His shoes were scuffed, his jacket slightly too big, borrowed from a friend who had insisted he look the part. But Ethan wasn't sure what the part was supposed to be. The audience clapped, politely, not loudly, not cruelly either, just enough to acknowledge that another contestant had arrived, another hopeful face. Another story waiting to be judged in seconds. Ethan stopped at the center of the stage and took a breath that didn't quite reach his lungs. He had waited for this moment longer than he could remember. Not just this stage, but the courage to stand somewhere like this and believe, if only for a few minutes, that his voice deserved to be heard. For years he had been the quiet one, the one people talked over. The one who smiled and nodded while others decided who mattered and who didn't. Growing up, Ethan learned early how to disappear. In classrooms, his hand rose halfway before sinking back down. At work, his ideas stayed folded neatly in his chest, unspoken, because louder voices filled the room faster. He wasn't ignored out of cruelty, just overlooked, like a song playing softly in a world obsessed with noise. The judges studied him now. One leaned forward, curious but guarded. Another smiled kindly, the way people do when they're preparing themselves for something forgettable. A third glanced at the notes in front of them, already moving on in their mind. "So, Ethan," one judge said, breaking the silence, "tell us a little about yourself." Ethan swallowed. I'm a warehouse clerk," he said, voice steady but quiet. "I load trucks, night shifts mostly." There was a pause. Not because the answer was wrong, but because it didn't sparkle. "And what brings you here today?" the judge asked. Ethan's fingers tightened around the microphone. He could feel his heartbeat in his ears, loud enough to drown out everything else. Still, he answered honestly, I want to sing, I always have." That earned a few nods, familiar, predictable. Dreams like his passed through this room every day. The judge smiled. "All right, and what will you be singing for us?" Ethan hesitated, not because he was unsure, but because he knew what was coming next, an Elvis Presley song. The reaction was immediate. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Soft laughter here, a raised eyebrow there. Somewhere in the audience someone whispered, "Elvis," like it was a punchline. One judge leaned back slightly, arms crossing, interest dimming just a bit. Elvis felt safe, old, overdone. In a room hungry for reinvention, Ethan had chosen history. "You don't hear that choice very often anymore," a judge said carefully. Ethan nodded. "I know." Another judge tilted their head. "Why Elvis?" The question wasn't unkind, but it carried doubt that he could make it new, doubt that he could make it matter. Ethan took another breath, this one shakier than the last, because his voice caught, just for a second, "because it's the first music I ever remember loving." The room quieted, not completely, but enough to notice the change. "When I was a kid," he continued, "my mom worked 2 jobs, cleaning offices in the morning, waiting tables at night. She was always tired, always worried." He paused, choosing his words like fragile glass. "But when she cooked dinner, she'd play Elvis records on this old radio we had, the kind that crackled more than it played." A judge leaned forward now. "She'd sing along," Ethan said softly, not because she was good at it, but because for those 3 minutes, she forgot how heavy life felt. His eyes shone under the lights, but he didn't look away. "That's why I'm here," he finished. "That's why I chose this song." For a moment, no one spoke. The audience shifted, unsure what to do with the honesty they'd just been handed. This wasn't a sob story. It wasn't dramatic. It was simple, real, and somehow heavier than expected. Still, uncertainty lingered. Personal meaning didn't always translate into performance. Love didn't always sound good on stage. One judge smiled gently. "All right, Ethan, whenever you're ready." The music had not started yet. The stage felt bigger than before, brighter, less forgiving. Ethan closed his eyes. For a heartbeat, he wasn't on a stage. He was back in a small kitchen, linoleum floors cool beneath his bare feet, the radio humming, his mother swaying slightly as she stirred a pot, her shoulders finally relaxed. He opened his eyes again. The room didn't expect much. They had no idea they were seconds away from being proven wrong. The stage remained silent, no music yet, no spotlight shift, just Ethan standing there, the microphone resting lightly in his hands, and the weight of hundreds of eyes pressing down on him. Silence can be louder than noise, and in that moment it roared. The judges exchanged glances, not cruel, not dismissive, but cautious. They had heard beautiful backstories before. They had also heard beautiful intentions fall flat the moment the music started. Talent shows were full of hope that didn't survive the first note. Ethan felt that doubt like a familiar shadow. He had lived his life inside moments like this, those suspended seconds where people decided who you were going to be before you had the chance to show them. He knew the expressions well: polite curiosity, tempered expectation, emotional distance. The kind of distance people keep when they don't want to be disappointed. A judge cleared their throat. "Before we start," she said kindly, "can you tell us which Elvis song you've chosen?" Ethan nodded. "Can't Help Falling in Love." The crowd reacted again softly this time, a few smiles, a few sighs, a song played at weddings, at movies, a song everyone knew, safe, predictable, the kind of song people think they already understand. Ethan felt his palms dampen around the microphone. He wiped one hand discreetly against his jacket and took another breath. "I know it's not flashy," he said, almost apologetically. "I know it's been done." One judge raised an eyebrow, waiting. "But I didn't choose it to impress anyone. That got their attention. I chose it because," he continued, "when my mom was sick last year, that was the last song she asked me to play for her." The air changed. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but subtle, like a door opening somewhere unseen. She was in the hospital for weeks. Ethan said, machines everywhere, beeping, lights that never turned off. His voice remained steady, but something fragile moved beneath it. "She couldn't sleep," said. The room felt too quiet, but also too loud. He paused, gathering himself. "So one night, I played that song on my phone. The same Elvis recording she used to sing to when I was a kid." He swallowed. Her eyes closed, her breathing slowed, and for the first time in days, she smiled. The audience leaned in. "That's when I realized something," Ethan said. "Music doesn't have to be new to be powerful. It just has to be honest." A judge nodded slowly. "You see," Ethan added, "I don't have connections, I don't have training, I don't even have confidence most days." He gave a small, self-aware smile. "But I have this song, and I have what it means to me." There was a long pause. The kind that doesn't feel awkward, but thoughtful. "All right." The judge finally said, "Let's hear it." The band prepared, the pianist placed their hands on the keys, but before the first note sounded, Ethan closed his eyes again, not out of fear, but intention. He wasn't thinking about the judges anymore. He wasn't thinking about the cameras or the millions who might one day watch this moment through a screen. He was thinking about a kitchen that smelled like soup and onions, about a woman humming off key while the radio crackled, about warmth that existed even when money didn't. This song wasn't a performance, it was a thank you. The opening chords began, soft, familiar, almost fragile. A few audience members shifted in their seats. Some folded their arms. Others prepared themselves politely, the way people do when they expect something decent but forgettable. Ethan lifted the microphone. He inhaled slowly. This was the moment where strategies usually mattered, where contestants showed off range, control, technique, where people tried to prove they belonged. But Ethan wasn't trying to prove anything. He wasn't trying to sound like Elvis. He was trying to sound like love. The first lyric hovered on his lips, but he didn't sing yet. He waited, not because he was unsure, but because he wanted to enter the song the way it had always entered his life. Gently, without force, the pianist glanced at him, surprised by the pause. Ethan opened his eyes, and in that second, before a single word was sung, something unexpected happened. The room leaned forward, not because they were impressed, but because they felt. invited into a story that wasn't chasing applause, invited into a moment that felt real. Ethan's voice was about to rise, but already the audience had begun to realize something. This man wasn't here to win, he was here to honor, and whether they knew it yet or not, they were about to witness something far more rare than talent. They were about to witness truth. The pianist's fingers hovered above the keys. For a brief moment, the entire theater seemed to hold its breath, not because anyone expected greatness, but because something about Ethan's stillness had shifted the air. He stood with his eyes closed, shoulders relaxed, no longer bracing himself against judgment. The first chord sounded, soft, simple, familiar. A few audience members leaned back, settling in. They knew this song, they thought they knew where it was going, weddings, movie montages, memories borrowed from somewhere else. Then Ethan sang, not loudly, not carefully, just honestly. Wise men say, his voice wasn't perfect, it carried texture, edges shaped by long nights, quiet kitchens, and unspoken feelings. It wasn't trying to imitate Elvis. It wasn't trying to impress the judges. It was trying to tell the truth. The room shifted almost imperceptibly at first. A woman in the third row stopped adjusting her coat. A man near the aisle lowered his phone, forgetting to record. One of the judges straightened in their chair, eyes narrowing, not in critique but in surprise. Ethan's voice didn't rush. It rested on each word as if it mattered, as if every syllable had lived somewhere in his chest long before it ever reached the microphone. But I can't help. Something cracked open, not in Ethan, but in the room. The audience wasn't listening anymore, they were feeling. A judge glanced sideways at another, eyebrows raised, silently asking the same unspoken question. Did you hear that? Ethan continued, unaware of the transformation happening in front of him. His eyes remained closed, as though he were singing to someone just beyond the lights, someone who didn't need convincing, someone who already understood. His voice grew stronger, not louder, but fuller, like a river deepening as it moves forward. Shall I stay? A woman in the audience pressed her hand to her mouth. She didn't know why tears had arrived so quickly. She only knew they felt familiar. Ethan reached the first rise in the melody, and instead of pushing through it, he softened. He let the note bend slightly, imperfectly, and that was the moment when technique stopped mattering. The moment when the song stopped being his. It belonged to everyone now. One judge's pen lay forgotten on the desk. Another leaned forward, elbows on knees, eyes fixed on Ethan like they were afraid to blink and miss something sacred. Ethan opened his eyes briefly and saw it, not applause, not approval, but attention, the kind he had never known how to ask for. He swallowed, barely noticeable, and kept going, like a river flows. His voice trembled here, not from nerves but from memory, the kitchen, the radio, his mother's humming, the way she used to close her eyes when she sang, like she was somewhere else entirely. Ethan sang the line as if he were walking back into that room. The audience felt it. Not as spectators, but as participants. People thought of their own kitchens, their own parents, the songs that once made everything feel okay, if only for 3 minutes. A judge's eyes filled with tears. He didn't wipe them away, he didn't need to. Ethan reached the chorus, and for the first time he allowed himself to lift his chin. The note carried, not because it was powerful, but because it was open. Unprotected. The crowd didn't move, no coughing, no shifting, no whispers, just stillness. When Ethan's voice cracked slightly on the word love, a few people flinched, expecting him to stop. He didn't. He sang through it. That crack became the most beautiful sound in the room because it proved something. He wasn't pretending, he wasn't performing, he was offering. One judge whispered, barely audible, "Wow." The other nodded slowly, eyes locked on the stage. Ethan's breathing deepened as the song carried him forward. With each line, his shoulders loosened, as if he were setting down years of quiet self-doubt, one note at a time. This wasn't redemption. It was recognition. The audience wasn't cheering yet, not because they didn't want to, but because they couldn't. Applause would have broken the spell. Ethan reached the final verse. By now, tears were visible across the room. Not dramatic sobs, just quiet, honest emotion, sliding down cheeks unchecked. Even those who had smiled skeptically at the mention of Elvis now sat completely still. They had underestimated the song. They had underestimated the man. The final note approached. Ethan opened his eyes fully this time, and for a brief, breathtaking second, he wasn't afraid. He sang the last word as if it were a promise. As if love, once given, never really leaves. The music faded. The note hung in the air, fragile, glowing. Silence followed, not confusion, not hesitation, reverence, and in that silence, everyone knew. History had just been made. The silence didn't break right away. It lingered, soft and sacred, like the room itself was afraid to interrupt what had just happened. Ethan stood frozen at center stage, microphone still raised, chest rising and falling as if he had just run a long distance. His hands trembled now, not from fear, but from release. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then one person stood. A woman near the back of the theater rose slowly, almost uncertain, as if asking permission from the moment itself. Her hands came together in a single, quiet clap. Then another person stood, and another, like a wave gathering strength. The audience rose, not all at once, but together. Applause grew from a whisper into thunder. The sound filled the theater, bouncing off walls, lifting the air, wrapping around Ethan like something solid. He lowered the microphone, overwhelmed. This wasn't polite applause. This was gratitude. The judges stood too. One of them pressed a hand to his chest, shaking his head in disbelief. Another wiped tears away openly, no longer caring about cameras or composure. The third simply stared at Ethan, eyes wide, as if recalibrating everything she thought she knew about performance. Ethan felt the applause before he understood it. It hit him in waves, years of being overlooked dissolving into something warm and unfamiliar. He blinked rapidly, trying to steady himself, but tears escaped anyway. He didn't hide them. He didn't need to anymore. One judge reached for the microphone. I don't even know how to start," she said, voice unsteady. The room quieted again, not out of command, but respect. "Ethan, that wasn't just a song." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "That was love in its purest form." The audience nodded, murmuring in agreement. Another judge leaned forward. "You know," he said, "people come on this stage every day trying to be unforgettable. They chase moments, they chase reactions." He looked directly at Ethan. "You didn't chase anything. You offered something." Ethan swallowed hard, nodding slightly. "And that," the judge continued, "is why we couldn't look away." The third judge spoke next, her voice softer than before. "When you walked out here, I'll be honest, I didn't know what to expect." She smiled gently. "But you reminded us that greatness doesn't always announce itself." The crowd erupted again, applause surging like affirmation. Ethan stood there, overwhelmed by a realization he had never allowed himself to believe. He wasn't invisible. "Not here, not now." The judge raised a hand, quieting the room once more. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Who were you singing to?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He looked out into the audience, past the lights, past the cameras, towards something only he could see. "My mom," he said. The word alone was enough. The judge smiled through tears. "She heard you." That was when something extraordinary happened. A man in the front row lifted a small photograph above his head. Cameras caught it instantly, a faded picture of a woman, smiling. He held it with both hands, eyes wet. "My mother loved Elvis too." He whispered to no one in particular. Nearby, a young woman reached for her father's hand, squeezing it tight. In another row, someone quietly wiped their eyes, thinking of a voice they hadn't heard in years. Ethan hadn't just sung a song. He had unlocked memories. He had created a shared space where grief didn't feel lonely, and love didn't feel fragile. The host stepped onto the stage, eyes wide with awe. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "this is why we do this." The crowd roared again. Ethan laughed softly through tears, shaking his head as if none of it felt real. One judge leaned toward him. "Do you know what you just did?" Ethan hesitated. I just sang." "No," the judge said gently. "You reminded us who we are when we listen." The audience rose once more. this time not out of surprise, but unity. In that moment, Ethan realized something powerful. This wasn't about winning. This was about being brave enough to show up with your whole heart. No armor, no disguise. He had done that, and the world had answered. As the applause finally softened, Ethan took one last look at the crowd. Strangers, friends, family, in a way, all connected by a song older than the room, carried by a voice no one expected. And for the first time in his life, Ethan stood tall, not because he was chosen, but because he was seen. Backstage felt quieter than Ethan expected, not empty, just softer, like the world had lowered its voice out of respect for what had just happened. The applause still echoed faintly through the walls, but here, behind the curtain, everything moved at a human pace again. Ethan sat on a folding chair, elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped together as if grounding himself to the moment. His heart was still racing, but beneath it was something new, peace. A production assistant offered him water. He nodded his thanks, took a sip, and let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding for years. A phone vibrated in his pocket. He hesitated before pulling it out, almost afraid the screen might shatter the reality he was still living inside. Then he saw the notification, voicemail mom. His fingers trembled as he pressed play. Her voice was weaker than he remembered, but unmistakably hers, warm, steady, proud. "Ethan," she said softly, emotion thick in every syllable. "I heard you every note. I knew you'd sing like that, because that's how you love." Tears spilled freely now. "You didn't just sing Elvis," she continued. "You sang your heart, and that's all I ever hoped for you, that you'd never hide it." The message ended. Ethan pressed the phone to his chest, closing his eyes. For a long moment, he didn't move. He didn't need to. Out there, on that stage, people would remember his voice. They'd talk about the song, the moment, the surprise. But this was the real victory. A producer crouched nearby. "You okay?" she asked gently. Ethan nodded. "Yeah," he said, smiling through tears. "I really am." When he finally stood and walked back toward the stage, the lights felt different now. Less blinding, less demanding, like they were no longer asking him to prove anything. The host met him with a hug, unscripted, genuine. "You changed the room," the host said quietly. "People are still talking about it." Ethan shrugged slightly. "I just told the truth. That's harder than it sounds," the host replied. As Ethan exited the theater later that night, the city air wrapped around him, cool and alive. A small group of people waited near the doors, not for autographs, but for connection. One woman stepped forward. "My dad used to sing that song to me," she said. "Thank you for reminding me." A man nodded beside her. "You made me call my mom," he added. "I didn't realize how long it had been." Ethan listened, humbled. He realized then that the impact of kindness is rarely loud. It moves quietly, from heart to heart, long after the spotlight fades. Days later, clips of his performance traveled far beyond that stage. Millions watched from living rooms, hospital beds, break rooms, and kitchens that smelled like dinner and memory. Comments poured in. "I thought of my mother. This made me forgive someone. I didn't know I needed this today." Ethan read them slowly, carefully, never rushing past a single word. Each message felt like proof that gentleness still mattered in a noisy world. He returned to his life not as a star, but as someone changed. At the warehouse, coworkers greeted him differently, not with awe, but respect. They saw him now. They asked about the song, about his mom. Ethan answered every question with the same quiet honesty. One evening, after a long shift, he went home and pulled out the old radio his mother had kept. It still crackled, still imperfect. He turned it on. Elvis filled the room. Ethan smiled. He understood something now that had once felt out of reach. You don't make history by trying to be remembered. You make it by remembering what matters. That night on stage wasn't the end of Ethan's story. It was the beginning of a life lived without hiding. And somewhere, beyond the lights, beyond the applause, love continued to sing, soft and steady, reminding the world that the most underestimated voices often carry the greatest truths.